So getting paid as a videographer is already hard enough. And what makes it even worse is that when you're starting off in video production, interviews are going to be your bread and butter. And if you want to get more dynamic interviews, a multi-camera setup makes a lot of sense. But how are you going to do that when you're only one person and you only have one camera?
I'll do it myself.
And in today's video, we're going to go over some simple tricks that you could shoot a multi-camera interview when you're only a crew of one and you only have one camera. Now, first things first you want to do is actually make sure your camera is set up for interview footage. Now, I do have a video about an interview setup for the Sony FX30, and we're going to actually use that camera for the majority of our examples. Basically, what you want to do is have multiple audio sources, make sure you have decent lenses, and a good way to adjust your exposure for whatever situation you're going to be in while shooting interviews. Now, when you're a crew of one or a solo operator, packing light is going to be incredibly important. And my lighting setup is actually pretty simple. I'm going to use my falconized panel because it rolls up and it fits into a nice comfortable carrying case. And I've also picked up these Zhiyun M40 lights that are not only bicolor, but they're also dimmable as well. Now, lighting interviews might be tricky because you don't always have complete control over your location, but the first thing you want to do is actually turn off the in-house lights. The reason why is because a lot of lights are going to be more tungsten, they're going to have a little bit of a yellowish greenish tint, and they don't really look good on skin. Now, in this example and in this situation, if I had more budget, I would add my own lights into some of the darker areas of my image, such as room lights that are turned off. But because we're working on a small budget, we're just going to work with what we have. When actually setting up our key light, you want a light from the window that you can't see. Now, an easy way to do this is to put your subject near a natural light source, like a window, for example. And what you're going to do is put your key light on the same side as that window to make sure you're doing something called motivating the light. Using window light might not give you the exposure that you want, but using your key light to actually motivate it gives you more dimension into your frame. And if you put it on the wrong side, what's going to end up happening is your image is going to look flat and pretty uninteresting. And quite simply, where I'm going to set up my M40 light is just going to be parallel to my key light. That way I'm going to have a little light coming off of the edge and separating my subject from the background because we are working with a completely white wall. Now, make sure you're also doubling your audio sources whenever you can. And generally speaking, I like using a lavalier or a lapel mic that I can attach onto my subject. That way I can get some decent audio even from a distance. And on top of that, I'm going to use a boom mic or a shotgun mic in order to get more directional sound just in case. Now, having dual audio is great for two reasons. One, you're always going to have a backup in case something goes wrong in terms of your audio track. And number two is that oftentimes one audio source is going to sound a little bit better than the other. Oftentimes when we have lavalier mics that are under our shirts and stuff like that, sometimes it gets a little bit muffled and sounds a little bit off. And the directional mic might sound better than the lavalier mic sometimes. And sometimes it's vice versa when you have a lot of ambient sound in your scene. You also want to make sure that you're monitoring your audio, and that just means getting a good set of headphones that you could plug into your camera in order to find out if levels are too low or if you're peaking. Now, I like using these Audio-Technica headphones, and I've had them for quite a while, hence they look a little bit worn, but they are really great headphones, and I've been using them to monitor my audio on any of the cameras that I use for interview footage. With actually composing interviews, it's actually going to look a lot different than something like a YouTube video unless you're shooting a talking head. Now, with interviews, it's going to be more conversational. Generally speaking, the interviewee is talking to somebody, which is more than likely going to be yourself. So you want to make sure that you're setting up your angles to be more conversational rather than being dead in the center. And what I like doing is using the grid lines on my monitor or on my camera, and I like to place my subject closer to the vertical lines in that grid. That way it doesn't look like an educational talking head video if I don't want it to, and when I'm shooting an interview, that actually looks quite natural and it makes a lot more sense. Now, when composing something like a YouTube video, it's more education. I'm speaking directly to you and not somebody else. Sitting in the middle of my frame makes a lot of sense. And the opposite's actually true in talking head videos because it'd be a little bit weird if I was talking to you like this. Now, we've placed our subject in the correct way that we need to, but you also want to make sure that you're actually between your camera and your key light source. And generally speaking, you're going to be on the opposite side of the vertical lines on your grid. So if your subject is more left justified, then you're going to be more on the right between your camera and your light. And vice versa if your subject is on the left. The reason being is because that's going to be a more natural look, and it's also going to help your lighting in terms of creating contrast and dimension in your image. Now, there are a couple of videos about how to properly place your audio sources, but you want to just make sure that they're actually close to your subject as possible. Basically, the closer your audio source is to your subject, the better it's going to sound. If you're too far away, and you probably have found in some videos that I've actually shot, if I'm too far away from the microphone, it sounds kind of weird. And that's why lavalier mics are handy, but you also want to make sure that your shotgun mic or your boom mic is also as close as you possibly can. And you could do that with boom poles or light stands, basically whatever helps you get your audio source as close to the subject as possible. All right, so this is a really important tip, especially if it's your first run around with interview footage and it's shut up. And the reason why I say that is you actually want to minimize how much you're actually talking during an interview. Obviously, in an interview, you're going to have to ask questions back and forth, but you want to make sure that there's some separation between you asking the question and when you're actually getting the question answered. While your subject is actually talking, you want to make sure that you're nodding your head, but you're not responding by saying any words back. That way you prevent getting your audio mixed up in the track of your subject talking, which actually could really screw things up if you're closer to the audio source than you want to be. Next is going to be something that's not oftenly talked about, but the actual look of your set and the wardrobe that your subject is using is also going to be incredibly important. Now for this interview footage, I wanted to make sure that the company logo is somewhere in frame, but it's also going to be against a white wall. And if my subject was wearing a white shirt, it probably would look a little bit weird. So when you swap for a black shirt, you actually have more contrast, and back on a white backdrop, the contrast between black and white is going to help your subject that much more pop off the background. So you know exactly who you're looking at and exactly who you should pay attention to. Alright, so what's the hack? What's the secret sauce that you need in order to shoot a multi-camera interview when you're one person and one camera? And to be honest, there's actually 3 of them. Now, one is actually changing up your lens. Now, changing up your focal length is going to give you a new perspective, it's going to give you a different angle of view, and you can change things like your aperture or different features in terms of the glass that you're using, and that's going to give the appearance of the fact that there's different cameras with different lenses, which is going to help your overall look. Number 2 is actually physically moving the camera from one place to the other. Now, what I recommend is having a master interview, which you're going to go through all of your questions and make sure you have everything that you need, and then for things that you want to hear again or things you want to hear retaken, you can start to move your camera and get different angles and actually re-ask those questions and get the same answers, or even slightly different ones. In multi-camera interviews, there's obviously different cameras at different angles, and moving your camera during an interview session is going to give the appearance that there was multiple cameras on set. And number 3, and a lot of people can do this in modern cameras nowadays, it's actually going to be shooting in 4K. Now when you're shooting in 4K, you're going to get a more sharper image and a higher resolution. And what's nice on the Sony FX30 is that you're also going to have a downsample image, which is going to give you that much more sharpness and detail. Now with shooting in 4K, when you go into post, you could actually crop in and reframe your image to give the appearance that you're using multiple camera angles. So I could actually take one shot while I'm shooting an interview, and I could actually punch that shot in to make it look like that I'm using a more tighter focal length. On top of that, I could keyframe my image in order to add different effects. Now a common one is actually using a fake dolly shot, which basically means you're going to keyframe your image on one position and then have it end at the other, and you want to smooth out that transition so it actually looks like your camera's on a slider. Now those are some major keys that I use when I'm shooting an interview and I'm a party of one. Now there is one more thing that you can use when shooting multi-camera interviews in order to kind of fudge the process and make it less obvious that you are shooting by yourself. And that's going to be, well, B-roll. Now, B-roll is going to be supplemental footage that goes along with your A-roll. And a lot of interviews, especially when working with small business, is going to have some form of B-roll. And one of the techniques that I use is that when I do have a shot in one camera angle, if I put B-roll on top of it, then I switch to a shot that I've either keyframed, moved my camera, or used some other technique. If I use that technique, I can go in the sequence of A-roll, B-roll shot, and then a reframed A-roll again, in order to give the effect that I'm using different cameras and I'm switching during my actual final interview edit. Now those are all the tips and techniques that I would use to shoot a multi-camera interview when I'm just by myself. A lot of you guys starting out are a crew of one, or maybe you only have 1 or 2 people helping out, and having multiple cameras on set at the same time is not only costly, but sometimes it might be a little bit more impossible. But getting creative and using some of these techniques is actually going to be a way that you could start to fudge the process, at least until you could afford another camera and operator. That being said, I hope you find it entertaining, or at the very least you guys learned something. If you guys want to see more videos on this channel, I'll probably just leave one over here. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.